us now is Micah Uetricht. Micah is the managing editor at Jacobin magazine and the co-author of the soon-to-be-released book, Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism. Thanks for being with us, Micah.
Thanks for having me.
Bernie Sanders has surpassed a lot of expectations at this point, staying in the race to go head-to-head with the establishment guy. Cable news even has to cover him now. What do you make of where he's at now?
Well, many people who support the Bernie campaign feel a bit discouraged right now because he has lost a number of the last couple contests. But the truth is that nobody could have guessed that someone like Bernie would have gotten this far in an insurgent candidacy like the one that he has run. He has gotten millions of votes. He has, I think, surpassed 10 million individual donations for his campaign. He's really shown that an alternative to the centrist neoliberal way of doing politics within the Democratic Party is possible, and that when you argue for things like free college for everyone or a free public health system at the point of service for everyone, that those are not absurd demands. Those are demands that resonate with millions of people. And so going forward, whatever happens within the primaries over the next days, over the next weeks, over the next month, whatever happens with this campaign for Bernie, I think American politics are not going to be the same post Bernie Sanders.
So a lot of people, including yourself, are talking about this campaign as if it's a movement and something which goes beyond what we normally see in electoral politics on a national level in the United States. Does his candidacy change politics in any substantial ways? Tell me how it's different from kind of this movement we heard people talking about back when Obama was running.
Well, Obama campaigned on the kind of spirit of a movement, right? He had this high-flying, optimistic rhetoric of yes, we can. He raised people's expectations really high. He also worked really hard now, as we see in hindsight, to make those raising of expectations very vague. It wasn't really attached to any specific policy proposals. It was a vague sense of yes, we can, of hope, of change, of optimism. Bernie Sanders has run on a much more substantive campaign thus far. He's said very explicitly we need to tax the rich, we need a Medicare for all system, and he has said that we need a broad grassroots movement of millions of people to achieve all of these things. I mean, his campaign slogan in 2020 is "Not me, us," meaning that it is not the individual candidacy of a uniquely moral and talented and smart candidate like Bernie Sanders that is going to bring change to the world, but it is the using of that candidacy to spark a broader movement. And we've seen that in many ways throughout American society, even since he ran in 2016. We've seen the explosion of left-wing politics through groups like the Democratic Socialists of America. We have seen grassroots environmental organizing around groups like the Sunrise Movement that are advancing the Green New Deal. Class politics in general are back on the table in the United States because of the Bernie Sanders campaign. And I don't think that we're going to, as I said before, even if Bernie loses this candidacy, even if he loses this election, we're going to see a lot more candidates like Bernie Sanders running in American politics and winning and transforming the political expectations of the American people.
Okay, so Micah, it seems like today things are looking rather normal in the United States, given that here in Ecuador we have a state of exception. We have other countries of the region and also in Europe asking for help from not just China and Cuba, but from other institutions. What do you make of the federal government's response to the coronavirus? And talk to us about what the Sanders campaign says on healthcare.
Well, I think that things look normal in the United States, maybe in comparison to a country like Ecuador. That might be because Ecuador is taking the coronavirus pandemic more seriously than we are in the United States. Things are really in flux right now, and so by the time this even airs, we might not know. Things might have appeared different in terms of how the federal government response. I mean, the government's initial response was to propose bailouts of industries like the cruise line industry and fossil fuel industry. The Trump administration since then has now started proposing things like cash transfers to every American. Proposing things that we never thought you would see from the Republican Party. They put in an initial $1.5 trillion stimulus to try to stop the stock market from tanking. So there's a wide range of responses that are sort of typical, like cutting the Fed's interest rate almost to zero to try to stimulate the economy and giving money away to Wall Street at very low rates, basically. But then there's also these proposals like direct cash transfers to citizens. The Bernie Sanders campaign has the centerpiece of the campaign has been about Medicare for all. It's been about saying that we need a public health system to deal with the crisis like this, certainly, but to also deal with the crisis of healthcare in the United States that existed before this, with 500,000 people every year declaring bankruptcy because of medical bills, with people foregoing treatment because they can't afford to go to the doctor, with insurance rates, even for people who have good insurance, being sky high. I just got knee surgery the other day, for example, and the pre-insurance cost of the knee surgery was $21,000. And so if you don't have health care and you needed a knee surgery like I had, you'd be on the hook for $21,000. So that even before coronavirus, there was a real crisis in the United States around healthcare, and that was the central demand of the Bernie Sanders campaign, was to address that crisis and to give us a public health system like every other wealthy country in the world. And the coronavirus pandemic is certainly confirming the desperate need for that kind of public health system in the United States. And the fact that we don't have one is making our response to it in the United States infinitely more difficult.
Okay, so paint a picture for us. How much interest is there in socialism now compared to, let's say, 4 years ago? And what are we attributing that to? Are we attributing some of this to Bernie's previous campaign, or why are people so interested in socialism now?
Well, I don't think there would be the space in society and the interest in society for a rejuvenated interest in socialism if there weren't very bad material conditions in the country. As everyone knows, record inequality, the state of the healthcare system that I just mentioned, people being crushed by student debt, rents going up, wages staying flat, everything that we already know about inequality in the United States and worsening conditions for average working class people. But it took the Bernie campaign in 2016 to really show that socialism and these bold proposals like Medicare for all and free college for all actually could have mass resonance with people in the United States, because we're always led to believe that Americans are somehow uniquely conservative, that they would never go for these policies like Medicare for all, that smacks of socialism or communism, and so Americans would never be interested in that. And the Bernie campaign in 2016 showed that not only could you fight for those things and be credible to millions of people, but you could call your fight for those things part of democratic socialism. And so we see these crazy polls in the United States that show, in some cases, majorities of people having a favorable opinion of democratic socialism. We certainly see the huge expansion of groups like the Democratic Socialists of America, which is now approaching 60,000 members, of which I am a member, and also of which figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Rashida Tlaib in the House of Representatives are also members. And in addition to people who are from DSA winning elections, whether it's in the House or in city councils in cities like Chicago, where I live, where we have half a dozen DSA members who are now on the city council, there's also been an explosion in grassroots organizing, ranging from labor organizing to fighting for Medicare for all to fighting for more affordable housing. So all of this is being done under the banner of democratic socialism, both in the streets and at the electoral box. And I think that's only going to expand because, as I said, we've been told all of these years that you couldn't fight for democratic socialism in the United States, that you couldn't call yourself a socialist because the Americans would just never go for that kind of thing. That was foreign, scary stuff. And now we've seen since Bernie Sanders that actually there's millions of people who are hungry for that kind of political alternative in our politics.
Okay, so Bernie has said some sort of okay things about actual existing socialism in the global south. He's also kind of turned his back, some people would say, on what could have been very important international allies. Would you say the top level of the campaign is applying any lessons from mass movements and parties in countries beyond Europe?
Well, Bernie Sanders has been someone who has spoken out more strongly, for example, against the coup in Bolivia against Evo Morales than any other Democratic politician on the national stage. He's also spoken out for Lula in Brazil. And as your viewers may know, the relationship between Bernie and what he thinks about his past with visiting the Soviet Union in the 80s and establishing a sister city program, going to Managua, Nicaragua in the 80s, what he said about the Cuban healthcare system. Bernie is someone who has always said at the same time that there are authoritarian aspects of some of these systems like Cuba, and they have made incredible gains for their people in systems like healthcare that the United States could frankly learn from to establish a better way of living for its people. And Bernie Sanders, just in the debate with Joe Biden the other day, Joe Biden made this a central issue, saying Bernie Sanders is out here praising communist dictators like Fidel Castro and praising the authoritarian system of Cuba or praising the authoritarian system of China. And Bernie has never backed away from saying that while he does have critiques of some aspects of those systems, we also have to reckon with the fact that these systems have brought enormous numbers of people out of poverty. They were, in the Cuban case, responding to a brutal dictatorship and made conditions immediately better for people, despite the embargo from the United States, despite the decades of attempts of sabotage of the Cuban government by the United States and through the CIA. And so Sanders has always done both at the same time of talking about those things. It's become a major issue in the election. And despite the fact that his opponents are attacking him on his praise of the gains under healthcare and against poverty and illiteracy in countries like Cuba, he hasn't backed away from doing that.
Okay, so Micah, what's your response to these Bernie bro comments? I see them online and on cable news and haven't actually yet had the opportunity to ask campaigners who are women or Black Americans how they feel about those yet. But how are those around you responding to suggestions that Sanders and his campaign does not actually represent these groups?
I think the attacks on Bernie bros have happened precisely because Bernie Sanders has such a rock solid past of always fighting for things like Medicare for all, always fighting inequality in society, always wanting to build working class power in the United States. He has been consistent in a way that few other politicians in American history have ever been. And so because you can't quite attack Bernie himself on these issues, you have to say things about random supporters on the internet who are allegedly rude to people online. And, of course, I'm not in favor of anyone being rude on the internet, but I also think that it makes sense that when Bernie Sanders is the only one who is standing steadfastly for the conditions that can allow people's lives to thrive, to make sure that everyone has health care, to end the kind of rampant inequality that we have, to do all of these things that are really life and death issues for people in the United States, that some of his supporters might get a little angry when people speak out and say, actually, no, we don't need a public health system. Actually, no, we don't need to tax millionaires and billionaires. It makes sense that people would get a little angry about that. I don't think that the kind of behavior that he's talking about is unique to Sanders supporters. We also don't even know who, if anybody knows how the internet works, anyone can start a Twitter profile and claim to be a Bernie Sanders supporter or a Donald Trump supporter or whoever they want to be, and then make that candidate look bad by saying rude things online. So I think that the whole discussion of Bernie bros is sort of absurd and is a distraction from the real life or death issues that are at stake in what Bernie Sanders is fighting for in this campaign.
Thank you so much, Micah. We've been speaking to Micah Uetricht, the managing editor at Jacobin magazine and the co-author of a soon-to-be-released book, Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism.